Marvel Rivals players are apparently calling out to the game for a lack of queer couples. Yes, really, that sentence forms part of a headline that thegamer.com is currently running with. But before we clutch our pearls and warm up our pitchforks, we need to ask a very basic question. Who exactly is saying this? Is this some huge community movement, players rising en masse to demand relationship representation in a competitive hero shooter of all bloody places, or just another vague excuse for game journalists to push a message? Because that's the part they never want you to look at. Not the headline, not the moral framing, but the scale. Is this a genuine groundswell of feedback from the player base, or are we talking about a handful of social media posts cherry-picked to fit a narrative? After all, this is a frenetic, fast-paced 6v6 hero shooter where characters launch one another into black holes, throw taxis as improvised weapons, and turn entire maps into cosmic punch-ups. Nobody is asking whether Ryu and Ken are holding hands in the middle of a Street Fighter match. So where did this apparent sudden obsession with queer couples in Marvel Rivals actually come from? Is it coming from the players, or from a journalist desperate for the clicks? I am Lady Decade, and if you'd like to hear all of the most ridiculous stories coming out of the gaming industry at the moment, then hit that subscribe button, because today we are talking about, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but Marvel Rivals and queer couples. The modern world is certainly vastly different from the one I remember growing up in. If you were playing video games throughout the 90s, you'll remember it was an awesome time to be alive. Marvel games, for example, were absolutely bloody amazing. But what's really cool is that you can use my links below to get a massive 61% off the 7-game spanning Marvel vs. Capcom arcade collection. And you can also save 78% off the massive Cowabunga collection, 83% off the Capcom Fighting collection, 82% off the Capcom Beat 'em Up bundle, and up to 90% off of thousands of modern titles too. So happy shopping, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this video. Every now and then you see a moment in gaming discourse where it becomes painfully obvious that someone in the press has written about a scandal that probably doesn't exist, and on the surface at least the headline in question seems like pure performance. Marvel Rivals players call out the lack of queer couples in a season centred around love. Not some fans ask, not players debate, not even a few comments highlight, no. The players, plural, collective, a mass demand. The wording is carefully chosen to imply that the Marvel Rivals community has reached such a fever pitch that you can barely queue for a match without someone shouting, "Where are our lesbians?" It presents this as a groundswell, a wave of sentiment, a revolt. But if you actually read the article, that supposed movement simply isn't there. So you're not shown Steam review patterns or Reddit mega threads or Discord uproar or polls or anything that even vaguely resembles meaningful evidence of a broad concern. At most, we are told that this conversation has been bubbling in the community and are pointed towards a small handful of social media posts. That is a world away from what the headline implies. It is the journalistic equivalent of pointing at a puddle and shouting "Flood!" In my opinion, this is where the gaslighting comes in. The author, Rhiannon Bevan, is not describing a phenomenon that clearly exists. She's reverse engineering a phenomenon from thin air. The order of operations is backwards. She begins with the conclusion, Marvel Rivals is failing players by not showcasing queer couples, and only then goes to present what she can dig up to make that conclusion feel inevitable. And that approach is important because it tells you the article's purpose was never to understand what players care about. Its purpose seems to have purely been to stage a narrative. And what's really quite telling though is that you don't have to zoom out very far to see why this sort of thing is so common at The Gamer. Bevan is not working in a vacuum. She's not some lone eccentric scribbling in the margins. She is writing for a site whose editor-in-chief, Stacey Henley, went on BBC Radio 4 to denounce J.K. Rowling and Hogwarts Legacy so aggressively that the BBC's own editorial complaints response later acknowledged the programme should have challenged her claims more directly during the broadcast. That doesn't make Henley a criminal or a monster, but it does tell you something about the editorial culture. Moral crusading isn't an accident, it's a house style. When the person steering the ship treats ideological confrontation as part of the brand, it's hardly surprising that the crew start treating players as a rhetorical shield for their own politics, instead of a group of people they have to listen to. And this is the context in which Bevan's Marvel Rivals piece becomes revealing. It's not a dispatch from the front lines of a community controversy. It is a mission statement disguised as coverage, a piece written to enforce a worldview, then retrofitted with just enough anecdotal material that it can pretend to speak on behalf of everyone else. The huge audience Marvel Rivals has doesn't matter. The game doesn't really matter either. What matters is that the headline can be used as another brick in an ongoing culture war. Speaking of the culture war, do you remember the period when the only culture wars happening were Nintendo versus Sega or the Sony PlayStation against the world? If you can remember this time fondly and want to relive it all over again, be sure to subscribe to my new retro channel, Lady Arcade. This week we looked at the history of the completely ridiculous Sega Tower of Power, but I have covered all sorts of oddities from the Atari Jaguar to the Vectrix. Click the end card after watching this video and you will be able to go straight there.
Double the failure!
Now, let us actually talk about why people love Marvel Rivals, because the stupidity of the whole thing becomes apparent the moment we remind ourselves what genre we're dealing with. Rivals is a team-based hero shooter, effectively a hero brawler. It is pure frenetic, aggressive mechanical expression, positioning, cooldown management, map geometry, swap windows, damage arcs, and tempo control. The attraction is simple. You pick a character, you hurl yourself into combat, and you learn through repetition and pain exactly how far you can push before you are punished. It is a game where half a second separates victory from embarrassment, and where your decisions are measured in muscle memory rather than identity discourse. You wouldn't think that most players are sitting there thinking about courtship. Its player base is making micro decisions under pressure, and the reward loop is built around skill, timing, and coordination. And that's why Marvel Rivals works. It offers immediacy, clarity, and adrenaline. Now, if two characters happen to be in a couple, then fine, but if they're not, also fine. It doesn't change what the game is for. However, Bevan's article treats that reality as an affront. The problem is, in her eyes, not that Marvel Rivals is mechanically poor or exploitative or unpopular. It clearly isn't. But that its current season, centred thematically around love, is not using that theme to showcase queer couples at the level of visibility that she expects. It's not enough for her that queer characters exist in the game. Their relationships have to be explicitly staged and performed to her satisfaction. The absence of such a spectacle is treated as the absence of representation. And here, remarkably, Bevan undoes her own argument with her own words. Early in the piece, she acknowledges what should logically collapse her thesis. Marvel Rivals already contains a canonical queer relationship, she writes. For instance, Angela mentions her wife Sarah, but not in a way that indicates that they are in a romantic relationship, before going on to complain that there are no actual queer couples in the game right now. In other words, the game features a canonically lesbian character whose wife is firmly established in Marvel's wider canon and is acknowledged in-game throughout Angela's references to her. And yet this is effectively dismissed because it is not sufficiently theatrical enough. That is the goalpost shift in a nutshell. You don't have to agree with Marvel Rivals' creative priorities to see that this is a very strange hill to die on. We're talking about a fast-paced PvP shooter where players are overwhelmingly preoccupied with balance changes, new heroes, tank shortages, lag, monetization, and whether a particular ultimate is overtuned. The visible community discourse on Reddit, on Steam, in Discord is dominated by those concerns. Sure, there are isolated conversations about representation, as there are for any game with a large roster, but there is nothing that plausibly resembles a broad uprising demanding that Season 5 be converted into a queer romance showcase. The headlines "Players Call Out" framing does not reflect the centre of gravity of what players are actually talking about. This matters because the gamer's piece doesn't read like something written for players, it reads like something written to them. There is no serious engagement with why Marvel Rivals is popular. The pace, the satisfaction of its swapping systems, the feel of the heroes or the map design. These things are taken for granted, if they are even mentioned at all. Instead, the game is treated primarily as a missed opportunity for them to stage their particular politics, and the players are invoked as a convenient shield for that agenda. And here is where the gaslighting element becomes even more obvious. Bevan could, in theory, have written an honest article saying, "I personally wish Marvel Rivals would do more to foreground queer couples." That would at least be transparent about whose desire is being articulated. Instead, the responsibility is offloaded onto an amorphous community that never voted for her. When she writes "Players Call Out," she encourages readers and developers to believe that they are facing market pressure, not a columnist's personal preference. It is a way of smuggling activism into the tent under a false flag.
Coming at you!
All of this would be ridiculous enough if Marvel Rivals were a small Western indie title. It becomes outright farcical when you remember who actually makes the game. Marvel Rivals is developed by NetEase, a major Chinese company whose core team for the project is based in Guangzhou. That matters because China is not operating under the same cultural and regulatory frameworks as Britain or the United States. For years, Chinese regulators have imposed strict constraints on LGBTQ+ representation in mainstream entertainment. Television and web drama rules have explicitly targeted the depiction of same-sex romance, and internal guidance around games has warned that titles focused on gay romance or featuring effeminate male characters may struggle to gain approval. LGBTQ+ content is routinely toned down, censored, or edited out altogether for domestic release. And the thing is, you don't have to approve of those policies to acknowledge that they exist. In this context, demanding that a Chinese studio front-load overt queer romantic spectacle into a globally distributed live service shooter is not a simple request for better representation, it is a demand that they steer very close to regulatory red lines in their own home market. You can argue that perhaps they should be willing to take that risk, but pretending that the risk does not exist at all is naive at best. Western writers insisting that developers in Guangzhou jeopardize their domestic approval so that an English language outlet can feel ideologically flattered isn't progressive. It's a form of ideological export, cultural imperialism even. It treats a complex global product as though it should be no more than a personal comfort object. Once you factor in that dynamic, Bevan's piece looks less like criticism and more like theatre. This isn't about the lived experience of Marvel Rivals players, it's about aligning a Chinese-developed game with a Western media outlet's internal culture war. The actual community, the people grinding the ladder, complaining about balance, theory crafting, hero synergies, is largely irrelevant to the exercise. They show up only as a label in the headline. The most efficient way to expose this is simply to look at what happens when genuine player outrage breaks out in other contexts. When monetization goes wrong, you see it immediately in bombed user scores, angry reviews, massive subreddit threads, and memes spiraling out of control. When a game launches in an unplayable state, you don't need to hunt for proof. The outrage smacks you in the face, and by contrast, if you have a gesture at a vague conversation bubbling in the community and you cannot produce a single compelling snapshot of a player base in revolt, then you are not facing a player-driven scandal. You are facing a journalist who is emotionally invested in a story she cannot prove. In the end, the problem with The Gamer's article is not that it expresses a progressive-leaning view or cares about queer representation, or even that it wants games to be more expressive about relationships. The problem is the combination of inflated framing, thin evidence and a willingness to brush aside inconvenient facts like the Angela-Sarah relationship because they don't deliver the correct level of spectacle. It's criticism that refuses to be bound by the reality of the work or the reality of the audience. It treats both as props. Of course, Marvel Rivals did not ask to be dragged into this moral opera. It doesn't owe journalists a particular configuration of romance. It owes its players responsive, satisfying gameplay, and on that front, it is doing exactly what it set out to do. Everything else is noise generated by people who cannot stand the idea that gamers are capable of enjoying something on its own merits without ideological supervision. Once you see how this works, you can't unsee it. You start to recognise when an outlet is describing player sentiment and when it is attempting to manufacture it. You see the difference between here is what people are actually fighting about in this game and here is what I wish people were fighting about so that my article feels important. You notice when representation is being discussed as a question of flesh and blood characters and when it is being used as a metric on an activist checklist. Marvel Rivals has a canonically queer character with a canonically queer wife. The game is being played and enjoyed by people who are far more concerned with their own win rates rather than whether a trailer includes a hand-holding shot. The headline that tries to pretend those players are seething about the lack of queer couples is not a window into the community. It is a mirror held up by journalists to reflect her own priorities back at herself. Also, don't forget that by using my link below, you can get a massive 61% off the 7 games spanning Marvel vs. Capcom Arcade Collection, 78% off the massive Cowabunga Collection, 83% off the Capcom Fighting Collection, 82% off the Capcom Beat 'em Up Bundle, and up to 90% off of thousands of modern titles too. I'd also like to remind you that if you want more retro goodness, then you can head over to Lady Arcade, where I have covered the history on a cornucopia of consoles. And if you really love what I do and want to support me in a more personal way and access my behind the scenes cosplay library and more, become a backer over on Patreon. I look forward to potentially speaking with you over there, and I'll see you all again in the next video.